Anytime you use electricity, it has to be transported through the electricity network before it can reach your house. This doesn't come for free though. The network operators have to earn back their costs somehow. So, how is the network tariff calculated? And how does it affect the electricity prices for you as a consumer? The learning objective for today is to understand what makes up the final end consumer electricity price and which principles apply when establishing network costs. Let's start with an overview of the electricity system. First, we have generation. Generators feed the electricity produced into the transmission grid. Then it is distributed to the consumers. Typically, the location of the generation is far from that of consumption. Corresponding to each step in the technical level, there is an economic aspect that affects the final electricity price. For generation, we have the production cost of electricity. For transmission and distribution, we have the cost of transport. And in the end, we have the role of retailers who sell the electricity to the consumers. In practice, it may be slightly more complicated than this. However, this is the basic idea. Let's try to understand what impacts the price at each step. Again, the supply and demand curve may illustrate what is happening. For the cost of generation, it's not the price of a specific generator which defines the consumer cost, but the market price. The market price is set by the marginal generator in the system. This is established for each hour according to the matching of the supply and demand curve. So, the first step when establishing the end user's prices is to know what is the specific electricity market price for the region where the customer is located. For transmission and distribution, it's quite difficult to attach a specific cost to a specific transport. Sometimes, as consumer, you don't even know where your electricity comes from. In addition, the network is a monopoly, and thus a competitive price cannot be established. For the latter reason, the price of transmission and distribution is regulated. The regulator sets the network price, or rather the network tariffs, for the use of the network. And these tariffs are set in such a way that for each specific type of consumer, a specific, transparent and non-discriminatory tariff applies. The regulator makes a calculation of the total cost for transmission and allocates these costs to consumers. This results in a final cost per kilowatt, or a final cost per kilowatt hour. And the same holds for distribution. As a consumer, in the end, we pay the cost of the electricity plus the cost of the network. These form thus a surcharge. On top of this, we also have some additional surcharges. For instance, for the retailer who sells the electricity to the individual consumers, or for metering equipment. The type of surcharges depends on the specific local situation. The final electricity bill paid by consumers in Europe thus consists of several components. First, there is the market price for electricity. Then there are the tariffs applicable for using the transmission and distribution grid. And finally, there are the additional surcharges, for instance, for the retailer. In the overview, we have shown a total price in euro per kilowatt hour, but consumers can also pay of the price per kilowatt, so a capacity-based price. This holds especially for the network. The total network cost depends more on the capacity demanded by consumers, which defines the thickness of the cable, than the energy transported. So, In many countries, network tariffs are not energy-based but capacity-based. Nevertheless, this does not change the basic idea. When the network tariffs are set, there are several principles which are important to apply. The first principle is the principle of cost recovery. Cost recovery means that the tariffs allow the total cost of the network grids to be recovered by the total revenues from the tariffs. Of course, this is important to make sure that consumers pay for the transmission and distribution service. They should not pay less, but neither should they pay more. The second principle is cost effectiveness. While cost recovery means that the total cost reflects the total revenues, cost effectiveness means that the individual consumers have network tariffs which reflect the cost incurred by their use of the network. Of course, this is more difficult in practice. One method often applied is to have connection tariffs based on the capacity of the network connection. So consumers with a bigger connection pay more than those with a smaller connection, regardless how much they use their connection. In this case, we have a capacity tariff. Consumers only pay for the connection and not for the actual transport of electricity. In some systems, you are charged per kilowatt hour of transport instead. In others, both components make up the network tariff. One final important principle is that of transparency and simplicity. This should make sure that the tariffs are clear for everybody and that consumers know well in advance which tariffs they will be charged for their network use. In Europe, network access is non-discriminatory. As a consumer, I pay a network tariff depending on the characteristics of my connection. I do not pay depending on my status, my salary or my religion. And also, when I purchase electricity on the market, my network tariffs do not reflect where this electricity is coming from. It may be that the electricity is generated just on the other side of my town, in which case the electricity uses a fairly short route to my house, and I don't use the network too much. However, electricity can also be generated on the other side of Europe, in which case the electricity will make huge use of the network. As said, in Europe, the network tariffs are independent from where the electricity comes from. So the costs are not dependent on the location of the generator. The tariffs are flat fees, also known as postage stamp fees. If it were differently, and consumers would also pay for the distance traveled by electricity, then the cost for generators far away to serve a consumer will always be much higher than the cost for generators nearby. This will limit competition in the electricity market. By using postage stamp fees, you just pay for the connection to the grid where you are located, irrespective of where electricity comes from. This helps competition and makes it possible in Europe to have real competition between generators in Spain, in Poland, in Sweden or in Greece. So today we have looked at how the network costs are included in our electricity bills. And we have discussed the principles that are used to set these tariffs. Why not take a look at your own electricity bill? How much are the network tariffs in your country? And how much do they influence the final price for the electricity you use?